Hello friends, welcome to the Messianic channel Pardes Roots, and today we're continuing our Torah portion. We're actually opening up the book of Exodus. We slowly catching up to the current Torah portions as we started a little bit late in the fall. And the Torah portion is called the first name, which is the second book of Moses, is Exodus, which in Hebrew actually it is called names, and we're going to get back to it, but I want to also give the name of the topic that I wanted to discuss today about, and it's the story of Moses and the burning bush. And the topic is why we burn out, or the reason we burn out. Well, the name of the Torah portion, Exodus, in Hebrew, it is called names, Shemot, which is very interesting because the book is focusing more not just on exiting Egypt or exiting the life of slavery, but rather on who exited it and who was delivered from the slavery. In other words, people, or just like we said, names, persons. This is the focus of God. It's not just the delivery part, but rather us and the process of our life with God after we're delivered. Names. Now, every book of Moses, of Torah, has meaning, and we'll study further more about other books. But if you actually put them together, you have a very interesting prophetic sentence. Well, we already studied about Genesis, Bereshit, which means in the beginning. Now the second book is called Exodus, which is Shemot, means names. Now the book of Leviticus is actually called has called. It's in the beginning of the book of Leviticus when God actually has called the Levites. The fourth book is called Numbers in English, but in Hebrew it's called In the Desert. And the last book, Deuteronomy, is called Words, or also Things or Works. Now if you put it together, you have a whole sentence, a prophetic message to every believer. In the beginning, names that were called in the desert for words or works. It really beautifully describes our calling with us, with the Lord, our calling from the slavery to the desert, where we begin to hear God, and we begin not just to hear God, but we begin to follow His works or things. We begin to be about the kingdom of God and about His business and not our own. Okay, so the book describes to us about the salvation of Moses, how he was pulled out of water in the basket. If you remember the story, we're not going to get into it because we have a different focus today. And when he grows up in the Pharaoh's house, he sees his people that by that time was greatly multiplied under slavery. And he sees how, in particular case, an Egyptian beats a Jew. And Moses has this, we can say, a national indignation for his fellow. And, he comes in and he intervenes and he kills the Egyptian. Then eventually we see how the Jews didn't really accept this. And the next day or so, when he saw the Jews fighting each other, he comes to them and he tries to reconcile them. And they actually blame him for what happened in the previous days for killing an Egyptian, and they're telling him, are you going to kill us as well? So he gets offended, he gets hurt, and he goes into the desert for 40 years. He becomes the shepherd of the sheep. He lives a very simple life, and he's carrying this hurt with him of not being understood. Well, I know that some people would probably judge his act of killing an Egyptian. In my opinion, I see here more of a character that God was already developing in Moses as a leader and as a shepherd. Because in reality, this is one of the most crucial qualities for every leader and every shepherd, is to be able to intervene on time and to defend your sheep, to defend what God has entrusted you. And he already had it, just his own way, and then God worked in his life in order to shape it more in his way. But still, we don't see God condemning him for this act. I'm not saying that murder is good, God forbid. It's one of the commandments, do not murder. But in that particular case, and in many other cases, by the way, unfortunately, it does happen that evil comes, and our responsibility is to defend our family, even at a cost of life. And this is what he does as a good shepherd. But he gets misunderstood, as we see. Well, friends, many times leaders, when they see their sheep being under certain slavery, they cannot just stay silent and indifferent. So they intervene, and sometimes it might seem like or be felt like something rude. People might misunderstand or didn't get you, why you're being so passionate and sometimes even high temper about certain things. When the leader is actually trying to help us to be delivered from some sort of slavery. Perhaps we don't see it as slavery, and that's why we get it personally when some leader convicts us. But the leader, on the other hand, sees from God that we're actually being led away a little bit by our own desires into slavery, and he comes in order to take us out of that slavery. And sometimes it just doesn't sound nice in our ears, and we get offended, and we turn the leaders away from us by not really understanding them properly, that God might be actually speaking through them. And many times you have these tensions when leaders also get actually hurt or misunderstood because they wanted to help, but it turned out to be that now they're looked at as some sort of enemies. Well, he's in the desert, and let's read the text. Exodus 3, verses 1 through 3. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. Amen. Well, it's very interesting. The natural fire, we know, and Moses knew, it would have burned the bush off, right? Completely. But the bush was not burning out. So he realized that this fire is a special fire. And eventually he sees, when God speaks out of this fire, that it's God's fire. Well, here's the secret, friends. And here's the answer to our, so to speak, question, reasons, or why do we get burned out? Two reasons. I'll give you two reasons. There might be more. The first reason is because we are not in our own position. We're not in the place that God called us to be. And when you're not in the place that God called you to be, you don't have the right fire and the right resources in order to fulfill that position that God has given you. And you think maybe that God has given it to you, but very soon you see that you're actually burning out, because perhaps you are burning with your own fire, with your own desire, maybe a good desire, but it is not necessarily your place, friend. And that is one of the reasons why people burn out fast. Second reason is when people, they might be in their place, in their position, okay, and initially they have this God's fire, and I compare fire as to a passion, for example, God's passion to fulfill His will, to do something for Him, to serve Him, to lead the ministry, and so on. And when it is truly God's fire, we're burning like the burning bush, and we're not burning out. On the natural, someone else, if he, especially a non-believer, looks at our lives and looks at the intensity of our lives, he thinks like, if I was in his place, I would have already burned out. It's just a miracle that a person can have such pressure in the ministry and he keeps getting stronger and stronger. He's not burning out. Well, this is God. Just like with the bush, exactly with the bush. And a natural bush and a natural fire that is not burning it off because it was God's fire. Well, friends, when we burn out, or when we burn actually with God's fire, we're in our place and we have God's passion and God's love towards what we are called to do, with all the intensity and pressure that we might have, we're not going to get burned off. As a matter of fact, some people, like Moses, was observant on the side at the burning bush, looking at the burning bush. He was amazed, right? It was a testimony to him. Some people might look at you as the burning bush, that you're not burning out by, having this fire, having this intensity, and it will be a great testimony to them. But the reason why a servant of God can burn out, even being in his own position, that's reason number one, right? Number two. Number one we already mentioned shortly, briefly. But the reason number two, and we get into that, is that being in our place, sometimes we replace the fire. We're not burning anymore with the initial fire of God that we had, but rather we replaced it with our own fire. Actually, later on, when we go into the book of Leviticus, I believe, and we get to the sons of Aaron, who brought a strange fire, and they got burned off. Actually, they died, okay, because they brought a strange fire, not the fire that God commanded. Well, a very similar story takes place with anyone who replaces God's fire with his own, God's love with his own ambitions. For example, when people are not burning in humility for the Lord, but rather they are burning for their own fame, they're burning for their own promotion, and perhaps they're full of ambitions. And this kind of a people, when they exchange God's fire into human's fire, okay, emotional fire, eventually they will get burned off. Friends, these are very important lessons for us to take a look at and to examine and to scrutinize in our lives, to make sure that, first of all, number one, we are in our own place, in the place that God called us to be. Secondly, constantly we need to see that the enemy is not fooling us and not exchanging God's fire with a false fire, his own fire, with men's ambitions and with fleshly desires, even inside the ministry. And sometimes, unfortunately, we hear stories like pastors ending up in rehab centers, not for drugs or alcohol, but just emotionally being burned off, and they need some restoration. And I've studied the word from Genesis to Revelation, and I've never seen a true man of God who was burning with God's fire ending up in such a condition. Only people that either left their proper position and exchanged it with something else, or being in the right position, they replaced God's values with their own values, with their own ambitions. Now they're burning with their own ambitions and not God's love. They also end up many times in such a terrible condition. So may the Lord bless us and help us to be like a burning bush, a simple bush, but burning with God's holy fire that is sustaining us even in the most difficult circumstances and in the hardest pressures of life. May the Lord bless you, and we'll see you in the next video.